Sure. Yeah. Ask away about the homework question.
I have a question related to the interval. Like in the homework, there's a interval like symbolic is a second interval, but like it has like width larger than augmented 2. How do we notate that?
Yeah, I'll discuss that in one sec. Um, Give me one sec. I'll explain that. That was an accident, but it's going to be an instructive thing to discuss. So one sec. Let me just get this one thing set up here. Huh. I guess you can hear that, right?
Yeah, we can hear it.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. So concerning the homework, there was a situation that occurred where some of the intervals were actually bigger, or I mean, smaller than a diminished interval, and bigger than an augmented interval. And I'm surprised this hasn't happened before when I've been making my homework in the past. But I can show you what I mean.
Yeah, I made note of the examples because I always do it by the degree number and the half step number. And there's one where it's like 5 half steps and 5 like the 5th degree, and then like 3rd degree, like 4 half steps. Like,
Yeah. So I mean, okay. So here's the idea. So I guess constructing it from scratch, this interval right here is, I guess you know this interval to be a major second, correct? Whoops. So if I actually take this interval right here and I flatten this, now it's a minor second, correct? Now, if I actually take this interval again and I flatten again, now it's, well, okay, let me think of another example. This is weird because this is actually going to overlap. Okay, let me try with the perfect fourth, okay? So let's say I have this interval right here and it's a perfect fourth. If I flat it, it actually becomes a diminished fourth, right? Because an interval that's smaller than a perfect fourth, if we refer back to this chart right here, let's see. So if you're trying to construct a diminished interval, you find the smallest interval in that interval class and you calculate that interval. And then you shrink that interval a half step. So in other words, if we're trying to diminish a perfect fourth, well, the only type of interval that exists in the fourth interval class is a perfect fourth. So if you're trying to bring it down a half step, it actually becomes a diminished fourth. But if you flat it again, it actually, I guess what you could say is it becomes a doubly diminished fourth. Because the interval class it is still a fourth, but the number of half steps reflects actually that it sounds like more like a minor third, if that makes sense. This was inadvertent that this happened when I was doing the homework. I was just kind of flatting some previous answers or sharpening some the previous homework questions, and it ended up resulting in something that was doubly diminished and doubly augmented. So for example, I guess we can start from here. So if I have this interval right here, well, how many half steps is this? Well, you don't have to do it that way, actually. Let's see. I guess from an interval class standpoint, this is a fifth, right? And I think actually you do have to count the half steps. So if we actually do count the half steps, I mean, that's one way we can do it. It's been a while since we've reviewed intervals, but there's multiple ways you can figure out this interval. One way of figuring out this interval is by counting the half steps between this node and this node. And you have to kind of do two things. Whoops, sorry. You have to check the, well, you have to check that the interval class is correct in your naming. Move this out of the way. And you have to check that the correct number of half steps matches the naming. Okay. So this is actually on the one note. But what I mean by that is that when we're describing this, we have to actually look at the interval class itself and notice that it's in staff distance. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a fifth. I guess, I mean, this is more articulately described in the one note, but the staff distance of this interval, I guess I'll write that. Account for the staff distance of the interval, which in this case is a fifth. Account for the number of half steps in the interval. So in this particular case, if I flat this G, for instance, well, a perfect fifth that gets flatted, if the top node of the perfect fifth gets flatted, it becomes, in this particular case, it becomes a diminished fifth, because there are no interval, like you're basically making this interval smaller when you're diminishing it from this direction. And there's actually no way, there's nothing smaller. If we refer back to this chart right here, there's not anything smaller than a perfect fifth in terms of the name itself in the interval class. There's nothing smaller than that exists in the fifth interval class that's smaller than it. So we actually have to diminish it. What I mean by like something, let me show you a different, well, sorry, let me actually show you a different example just to better highlight what I mean.
Could you possibly do an example from the homework where?
Sure.
So like there was like 4 of them total that seemed not to work. One of them was going up, like from A flat to B sharp.
Yeah, well, I think I see one right here. Well, let's just take this one for example.
All right.
Okay, let's try this really quickly. Okay, so what we have is this. Okay. So in this particular situation, the staff distance of this interval is a fifth. That's known. I guess if we're actually trying to count the half steps in this, sorry, give me a sec. I'm using the wrong ribbon. Okay. I'll try to pull up the keyboard here so you can see what I mean. Okay. So in this particular case, E flat to A sharp, it basically has a distance of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 half steps, right? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so on a perfect fifth, you're expecting a distance of 7 half steps. Okay, this is one way you can think about it. So you're actually shrinking this interval by 2 half steps. If you shrunk this interval by 1 half step, this would become a diminished fifth. But since you shrunk this interval by 2 half steps, it becomes a doubly diminished fifth. That's one way you could do it. I guess another way you could figure it out is this. You could start out with an interval that you know, like this. Like you could start out with a perfect fifth. In this situation, you know what a perfect fifth below E flat is. It's an A flat, right? Then you can kind of work back to this situation right here, where you're like, okay, well, what would happen if I actually made this A flat an A natural? I'm kind of working towards this answer right here. Well, in this particular situation, this would be 6 half steps currently, right? Right. This is 6 half steps. If I did this again, and I shrunk this interval even more, well, I guess I can write 6 half steps is a diminished fifth, D5. Right. If I shrunk this one more time, well, what I get is basically 5 half steps, which is, I guess you could say is DD5, double diminished fifth. It's a little confusing, I know, but that's basically how you do it, if that makes sense.
Sorry, are we gonna get marked off on homework if we don't get it right?
No, I actually told the TAs that you won't get marked off for those particular passages.
Okay.
But yeah.
The big idea is just, so if it were, is there anything such as like double augmented?
Yes, there is something as double augmented. So let's see. So what I was trying to say earlier was basically an interval class basically is like a fifth and like a fourth and a third, right? It's that particular staff distance. So the intervals contained within an interval class by default are these intervals right here. So for instance, the intervals that are contained in the third interval class by default are a minor third and the major third. The major third is the biggest interval that exists by default in the third interval class, okay? If that makes sense. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that if you have, so let's say we're starting with, I just want to kind of work on this really quickly. So let's say we have a minor third right here. This is a minor third because it satisfies two things. The staff distance between this note and this note is a third. And also the half step between these two notes is 1, 2, 3, okay? It's 3 half steps, which by definition, if you get that particular situation where you have a staff distance of a third and you have 3 half steps between the two notes, it's a minor third. Now, if I raise this, if I basically stretch this interval a little bit, well, by naturalizing that E, it was flat before, now it's an E natural, now we have a major third, right? Okay, great. So now we're sitting in a situation where this is the largest interval in this particular interval class by the default, right? The minor third and the major third are the default intervals that you can work with that aren't diminished or augmented, right? So if I want to basically augment this, now I'm in a position to do so. If I sharp this E and make it E sharp, well, guess what? Now it satisfies this condition where I have a third and staff distance, CDE, right? But I'm also basically stretching this interval beyond the half steps that would normally exist in this sort of default, these default possibilities. Okay, so now I've got an augmented third. Okay, there's 2 ways I can doubly augment this third, okay? One way is I can actually, I don't know, you guys know this symbol, right? This is a double sharp. I can basically take this E and I can sharp it again, and now it's an E double sharp, right? Or I could actually take this bottom note, I could stretch it the other way. So I could take this C and I could flat it, and now I've got a doubly augmented third, right? So these are two ways, I guess, you can do it. I could do this. Whoops. So there's two, whoops, sorry, excuse me. These are the two ways you could do it. Right. Both of these doubly, so it's, I guess you could say AA3, and this is also an augmented third. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, this is something that I don't think you're going to see too often in actual music, but it's something that can accidentally result. You can see how I'm surprised that it hasn't happened before, but I guess it was a teachable moment. When you do see this, that's what it is. You basically have to reconcile the number of half steps in the interval against the actual staff distance of the interval, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Is that clear more or less?
I had one question about that example.
Sure.
Could you double flat the C as well for another scenario where it's a double augmented third?
Okay, so so what notes should I start with? So C and?
So like a double flat C and then a natural E?
That would actually go in the direction of augmenting it though, because remember, but the reason I say that is because you're stretching it in this situation. So C, E would be, oh yeah, exactly. You're asking about augmentation. So
yeah, if it was like another example of how you could get a double augmented of that, those two notes there.
Precisely, yes. So if you start with C and then you flat it, you would get basically an augmented third, and then if you did a double flat, you would get a doubly augmented third. Oh gosh, we can go even further than that. Now we have a triply augmented third, and now we have a quadruply augmented third.
That's evil.
Yeah, I mean this is some next level stuff right here. So if we have basically enharmonically speaking, what this looks like, oh gosh, this is hard to even look at. Yeah, so now from a third we have, whoa, actually, yeah, from a third we basically are creating an interval that sounds like a minor sixth from an interval that sounds like a third. Yeah, so this is probably the most extreme case. I'm glad I never accidentally gave you one of these, because you have to imagine so this is kind of the way I was working. I had intervals like this, and I have different processes for creating these intervals, and I was just doing this stuff. What if I sharp this note? What if I sharp this, flat that note? Oh, what if I sharp this note? What if I flat this note? And what resulted was some really gnarly doubly augmented and doubly diminished thirds, and other intervals. So you can imagine how it's easy for this to happen. But I guess the way that this could happen on your homework is if I had the same thing. I'm like, what if I doubly flatted this, and what if I doubly sharped this? Then I could result with more wild homework possibilities. So yeah. So I guess I'll be a little more careful this week, because that could spiral out of control very quickly. That's precisely how you even get double and triple augmented and diminished intervals in the first place. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So I wanted to discuss chords. I want to review chords a little bit more, because I know, oh yes, there's a question in the chat. In doubly diminished fifths, do both of the diminished represent diminished? Or does the first D represent doubly and the second diminished? That's a great question. To be perfectly frank, let me just look this up really quickly. So if I have, okay, let's see, doubly diminished fifth interval. Oh, because you put AA2 for doubly augmented second instead of doubly augmented. Okay, so this is obviously not what I'm trying to see. The new Detroit DD5 engine provides short. I mean, that's cool and all. Let's see. Excuse me. I believe the situation, I think what it really means is diminished, diminished versus augmented, augmented. I think it's easier to say doubly augmented or triply augmented, but really that's augmented, augmented third. Okay, great. Okay, let's go on and let's continue our discussion on chords. Okay, because I know this stuff can be a little confusing. I want to make sure that you understand it. So let's see. I'm going to create a chord right here. Okay. Off the top of your head, someone zoom in as quickly as you can. What quality is this seventh chord?
A dominant seven.
Dominant 7.
Great. Okay, multiple people zoomed in. Very good. How about this one right here?
Major 7.
Major 7, absolutely. Okay. How about this one right here? Whoops, I'm not done yet. Sorry.
Half diminished.
Half diminished.
Half diminished, absolutely. How about this one right here?
Fully diminished.
Fully diminished.
Fully diminished, okay. Great, okay. How about, what am I missing? Major, dominant, okay, I don't have a minor 7th yet. The reason I'm doing all this is these are the basic 7th chords, and I mean, these are some of the basic 7th chords that you can use as the basis for the chords you're trying to create. I think I lost a chord in the process. Whoops. Okay. So let's say this one more time. So this one right here is what? Dominant 7th, right? Great. I'll just write Dom 7. Ooh, Dom 7. Ah, gosh. Okay. This one right here? This
Major
is
7.
Major 7. All right, great. This one? Half
Diminished.
Dimin 7. 7. Great. This one's fully diminished, right? And this one's a minor 7. Okay, awesome. So we're in a situation now where if we want to construct extensions over these chords, we already know the underlying 7th chord. So for instance, if I took this and I did lap. Okay, so what would I put here? Well, let's see. What would I insert at this particular junction? I would put
9, 11,
9.
13.
9, 11, 13, correct. So actually what's interesting about this, I'm just gonna do this really quickly. Okay. What would I put here?
Wouldn't it still be 9, 11, 13?
It would still be 9, 11, 13. So this is actually something that is illustrative by, ooh, this is all bad stuff. All of these would be 9, 11, 13. Because remember, all of these, describing these extensions hinges completely on the root of the chord, on the major scale built on the root of the chord. So these notes would be the same extensions irregardless of the underlying 7th chord. So all of these are basically 9, 11, 13 chords. So this one right here is a C, fully diminished 7, 9, 11, 13. And this one right here is minor 7, 9, 11, 13. Okay? So that's basically what I have to say about that. Okay, so I'm gonna change some notes around. What did I just do? It was this. That's a 9, right? Now again, let me actually, just to make it a little maybe easier to understand, I'm going to draw a C major scale underneath all this. Okay? Okay. So this corresponds to this. Whoops, excuse me. This corresponds to this. This corresponds to this, right? This corresponds to this. This corresponds to this. D corresponds to D. F corresponds to F. And A corresponds to A, right? Makes sense? Hopefully, right? Okay. So in this particular implementation, this 9 is the same exact note as this D, right? But if I actually take this D, and in this situation, the ninth, the ninth is the same thing as the second of the scale. So if I actually take this D and I flat it, well, the situation that arises is this 9 becomes a flat 9.
Aren't flat 9s undesirable?
Yes, they are undesirable, especially when they're an internal interval. So can you hear this chord? It sounds a little strange because oh, geez, sorry. I just undid everything else I just wrote. Yeah, I just made the situation a lot worse. It's distorting a little bit. Let me figure out why. Yeah, so that's not really a desirable chord. So if someone gave you this chord right here, I wouldn't necessarily voice a chord like this. There are situations, obviously, where you could find a way to voice a chord, and you can find a way to justify any chord voicing. But this breaks some jazz rules by having a minor ninth right here. But anyway, what about this one right here? Let's say I took this F and I sharped it. What happens? How do I change the naming of this chord?
Sharp 11.
Sharp 11. Now it's interesting that Brosnan just brought up the idea of the minor ninth being undesirable, because as it turns out, by default, if you have a major 7 chord, the available extensions that you have access to, you're going to want to sharp the 11 from the standpoint that if you don't sharp the 11 and you leave it alone, you get this undesirable minor ninth chord interval. But if you actually sharp the 11th, you actually, between these two notes I'm describing right here, this makes up a minor ninth. But if you actually sharp this, let me remove these cautionary accidentals. Okay? If you sharp it, you actually remove the minor ninth from the equation. So listen to how these two chords sound. This is how this chord sounds with them. This is how it sounds without the sharp 11. Okay? It sounds a little bit icky. How about right here with the sharp 11? It sounds better, right? You're probably still getting used to these sounds, so maybe you can't make that judgment right off the bat, but this sounds better than that. I guess get that into your ears. It's all subjective, but this is one of the axioms that jazz harmony kind of bases its decisions around. It's just to avoid this interval of a minor ninth. Okay. Great.
I have a question.
Sure, yeah.
So if it's a 9 sharp 11 and a 13, would that make it a major 13th chord?
Yeah, so another way, that's a great question. So, okay, so would you ever call this a C major 13 chord? Now here's what I have to say about that. Let me actually show you. So this is what I have to say about that is this: that when you just declare the uppermost extension, the uppermost available extension, meaning the 13, you're actually also implying all of the extensions that are underneath it. However, there are certain extensions that are assumed to go with certain chords. So for instance, a jazz player would never play a vanilla 11 in a major 7 chord. They would play a sharp 11. So when you see a C major 13, the assumption is that there would be a sharp 11 and a 9 in there if you were actually to play this. So this actually goes into this concept right here. Let me actually, I wasn't expecting to talk about this, but let me just double check. Implied extensions in jazz harmony. Whoops, sorry. And there's so many charts of this available. Implied extensions, let's see if I can quickly find one. Implied upper tensions. Is this the chart that we're looking for? Okay, it's not a big deal. I can actually just tell you what they are. There are more than one possibility for several of them. But if I actually take these chords right here, for instance, these are good candidates for doing such a thing. Be nice. Yeah, there we go. Ah, geez. Okay. Okay, so I copied these over right here. So I'm getting back to this. Okay. So essentially, if you have a minor 7th, if you have a dominant 7th, there's actually many different extensions that you can use. So I'm going to not touch that one. I guess the two ones that you have to really be aware of is if you have a major 7 and you see a 13, you're expecting a 9 and a sharp 11. Okay. If you have a minor 7th, you're expecting a 9 and 11, a regular 9 and a regular 11. If you have a 13, if the chord symbol just basically says C13, which remember, the underlying 7th communicated by this would be a dominant, the quality of this would be a dominant 7. The idea would be that you would have to strike the 13, which would be at the 6th scale degree of a major key. But you actually have a lot of latitude over these particular upper tensions. So for instance, this is how you could actually do multiple things. If they're not explicit, they're just basically saying play this. But you could actually fill in. So this is one example of filling it in. This is basically that, right? I could do this. Whoops, that's enharmonically incorrect. Right? I could also, I mean, in this particular case, I added the 11, the sharp 11. In this particular case, whoops. In this particular case, I guess I added the 9 as well. I think there's other possibilities. The minimum in this particular case, if I did a C13, is that I play the C dominant 7 voicing, and then I also have a 13. But I could also reference other tones like this sharp 11, which I think is the more desirable choice, because if I didn't do a sharp 11, I would actually create a minor 9th interval. I could also reference the 9, right? I could do all kinds of things. I could also do, I think this would potentially work as well, right? So in that particular case, I actually did a flat 9. So actually, these chords might be worth analyzing. Let's do this. So let's analyze this in the old-fashioned syntax. So I have a C7 plus what?
13.
13, exactly. Okay. How about here? I have a C7. It's the underlying 7th chord, plus I've got what?
Sharp 11 and 13.
Sharp 11 and 13. Great. Okay, great. So now let's take a look at this one. So I have a C7, and I've got what? I've got a 9, a sharp 11, and a 13, right? All of these are referencing the 13, but I'm leaving out the 11, or I'm leaving out the 9, but I have latitude to do that as well. So now let's take a look at this example. Oh, whoops, that's not what I want to type at all. Okay, in this particular example, I've got a C7, and I've got, well, I've got a, what is this note in relation to the C major scale? This is a D flat, okay? So if I'm playing a C major scale, whoa, if I'm playing a C major scale, right? The second note of the D major scale is, the C major scale is D, correct? If I take that second note and I flat it, well, all of a sudden, now I've got a flat 2. Bring it up an octave, it's now a flat 9, right? Sorry, I think I got rid of one of the notes. So I put the flat in the wrong place. I meant to say that this is, wait a second. Wait a second, sorry, give me a second. That was correct, it just got moved down here. Okay. So to say the point one more time, if I have a C and a D, right, and let's say this D is up an octave, this is just the 9th scale degree, which is also equivalently the 2nd scale degree of the C major scale. If I take that note and I flat it, as I've done right here, well, now it becomes a flat 9, right? Great. So what we have here is a C7, same underlying 7th chord, but we also have, what do we have? We have a flat 9, a sharp 11, and a 13. Okay? So I guess all this is to say that if I'm given a C7 13 directive and someone's saying, hey, play me a C7 13 please, or even more vaguely, play me a C13 please, I could do many things in the real world. I think this is a duplicate, so I'm gonna get rid of this one. Yeah, I'm just gonna make sure, great. Yeah, I could do many things. I could include the 11. In this case, I'm gonna sharp the 11. I could include the sharp 11 and the 9. I could also, instead of doing a 9 sharp 11 13, I could do a flat 9 sharp 11 13. I could do other combinations as well. And as you get more advanced, you could actually invert these. So, instead of having all of these be snowmen, which they are, or levitating snowmen with some degree of levitational properties where you're leaving out one kind of chunk of the snowman, you're left in a position where you actually have many different possibilities once you actually invert these. So for instance, if I do this, right? Ooh, that doesn't look very nice. Is there no way to turn in homework 2, or is it just me not seeing it on assignments? Did I not put that on assignments? Is that true, class? It might be true.
It looks like that's true.
Okay, so I'll put it on Canvas right after this. Thanks for letting me know. Great. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So I guess going back to this particular, well, I won't go into open voicings in this particular case. But I'm going to kind of drive in this point a little bit more about these other chords. Okay. I guess we never got to slash chords last time. But I hope you guys still remember what a sus chord is, a sus2 and a sus4 and a C7 sus4. By definition, a sus chord has a suspended sound. They generally want to resolve to a snowman-looking chord, but there's another detail I want to say. A sus chord actually replaces a chord from a snowman chord. Replaces a note. So for instance, I guess I could say substitutes a note from a snowman chord. So in this particular case, the C sus2 chord is basically these particular exact scale degrees. It's basically 1, 2, 5 instead of 1, 3, 5. Right? It's a 1, 2, and a 5 instead of a 1, 3, and a 5. And basically the 2 is being substituted from the 3. Right? Or sorry, the 3 is being substituted by the 2. Right? So,
Professor?
yeah.
So I just have a question about sus chords, because in the examples that we've seen, usually it's the third that's being replaced by a different scale degree. And so I guess I'm wondering, is that basically how it is with sus chords? Like, is it usually just the third that's being replaced? Or are there sus chords with other scale degrees being replaced?
I think you've generalized it, actually. So in particular, actually, that's a good thing to just add. In particular, the third scale degree is replaced by the sus interval. That's actually a good consideration. I'm trying to think of another example where that isn't the case. I guess you could have a sus2, sus4. No, you can't. I guess you could have, I guess that one case that where it kind of falls on its head is where you have a sus2 and a sus4 because the third is being replaced twice. But this is actually a good way of thinking about it. So the third scale degree is, yeah, exactly. So it's the third scale degree that's being substituted. In this case, the third scale degree is being substituted by the 2, the sus2. And the third scale degree is being substituted by the 4th in the sus4. And the third scale degree in the dominant 7th is being substituted or substituted by the 4th. Oh yeah, there it is, substitution. So that's really what it is. That's the exact kind of formulaic way of thinking about it. So for instance, if I have a triad like this, and I want to suss it up, it's quite simple to do that. There's two ways I can suss it up. One way I can suss it up is by bringing this third down to a second. And now I've got a sus2, right? If I bring this third up over here, well, I actually have to be careful here. I actually have to make this part of the scale. Remember, I have to make this, the sus interval is actually part of the major scale itself. So I should clarify that as well. Sus interval is part of the major scale that is built on the root of the chord. So for instance, if I left this like this B doesn't exist in the F major scale, and we actually have something totally different. We actually have basically, this is referencing a major 7th chord, essentially. But we won't talk about that possibility for now. We'll just say that, just make sure that it exists in the major scale that's built upon the root of the chord, and we're all good. Okay? So let me actually find my little, whoops, the Zoom windows are hiding my controls. Okay, great. So how about this example? Whoops, so we're starting with an F major triad. And then I take this A and I bring it down. In this case, this G is actually part of the F major scale. It's the second scale degree of this root note, of a scale built upon this root note. Okay? So in this particular case, this is an F sus2. But you can see how these sus chords are really brought about by transformations on the third interval. Great. So let's see. Let's say we're all happy. We have a nice handy dandy seventh chord, right? We have a dominant seventh chord. It's great stuff, right? Now, let's say I just want to take this third note and I want to bring it up. Well, guess what? I have to first make sure that this fourth note is actually in the scale, right? That's built upon the root note, which it now is, because if I build an F major scale, this B flat is now part of that scale, right? So now this this chord becomes an F7 sus4. So I guess just to clarify, let me actually put these, let me bring about some syntax, actual official font here. This is an F sus4. If it likes me, it'll actually accept it. If I did some random thing like this, it won't like it. So, but if it does like it, it actually kind of makes it a little neater for me. Now, if I do this, right, then I have an F sus2. It like that. Great. Will it like this? If I write F7 sus4, it like that. Great. Okay. So you might ask, well, is there this? Does that exist? Let's see. I know it definitely exists because I just played it, but is it common? I guess so. Interesting. So in that particular case, the third is replaced by the second. This is common, but for some reason I see this much more often, the F7 sus4. But just for posterity, remember, same process always applies. I take this dominant seventh chord and I go blat. And now I've got an F7 chord where the third is now replaced by the second. And now I've got an F7 sus2. Interesting, right? Okay. So just to kind of clarify, the idea of sus chords where one note is substituted or sustituted, the third in particular, by the note that the interval that's actually contained or kind of defined by the sus chord, essentially the 2 or the sus4, right? That's sort of a destructive sort of process where the third is being destructively replaced by the second, right? There's no third once you substitute or substitute the second into the third, right? That's contrasting what an add chord is, right? In an add chord, you actually keep all the intervals, but then you're just adding. You start with the snowman, you're just adding a second, or you're adding a fourth, right? So, right? So you have this, right? This is by default. This is a major triad, right? I need a shortcut for that. Do this. And all of a sudden you have, well, you have an add 2, right? Because you had a major triad and now you're adding a 2, right? Okay. I don't know if I talked about this possibility yet, or I think I did, but it's worth going over again because it's confusing. You could do an add 6. Well, I guess let's stick to the topic of adds really quickly. So if I have this right here, I'm going to add an interval, okay? And tell me what I just did. What is this interval? Oh, sorry, what is this chord?
C major add 2.
Great, so I think my software will like that. C add 2. It's by default if you see nothing prefixed, or you see no suffix after this between the extension in parentheses and the chord itself, it will be major, okay? So let's see if I can do this. Whoops, I already did that. Okay, let's see if it likes it. What is this?
C add 4.
Okay, great. It liked that. What if I did this? Starting out with a minor triad. What do we have here?
C minor add 4.
There we go. It likes it. I'm happy. Okay. How about this one? C minor add 2. Right. So I always think of this particular chord as the Lionel Richie Hello chord. I played this last time, right? It's got a rich, lush sound, characteristic of a fancy restaurant. Yeah, just giving it that extra 2 just makes it that much more rich and crunchy and nice. So you can use these additions to kind of spice up your triads. Oftentimes, this kind of verges on the idea of being a cluster chord because you have all of these intervals kind of squashed together. And I like things like this. Like I like playing chords like this. What I just did there was that. I actually like that sound. I just did that. I like that sound. It just sounds a little, it sounds rich. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I know this is review, but I want to make sure that everyone understands this. Okay. So going to a major sixth and a minor sixth, it's interesting, right? A major sixth and a minor sixth is really just an add chord, but you're just adding the sixth. It's like a special case of an add chord, where if you're adding the sixth, you no longer call it an add 6, or will it even let you call it that? Let's see, maybe it will. No, it doesn't like it, see? So for whatever reason, syntactically, when you add the sixth, you don't call it an add 6 chord. You actually call it a blah, blah, blah 6 chord. So for instance, if I have a C major triad right here, and I add a sixth to it, well, all of a sudden, this particular chord now is a C major 6 chord. Okay? This is not a C first inversion. That's a distinction that I want you to be aware of. This is not a C first inversion. But if I have this, okay, if I have this, right? And remember, just like before, the sixths are referencing the major scale that's built on the root of the chord, okay? So this A, so in this particular case, we have a C minor triad that's underlying, right? But then we also have a 6, okay? And this sixth is the same sixth as this sixth. This note is the same as this note because the major scale that is built upon this root, on both of these roots, is the same. It's the same root, right? Okay, so you have a C6, a C minor 6. Okay, great. I think that's all I have to say about 6 chords. I guess if we're talking about slash chords, that's another thing. So if I have this notation, if I have this, yeah, I guess this is notation. If I have this, I can actually, what you're accustomed to doing, I guess, is you're accustomed, from a Roman numeral analysis standpoint, well, I guess I can actually, what you're accustomed to doing is doing something like this, where you have like a C, well, let's say we're in the key of F major. You're accustomed to doing this. For the key of F major, you're accustomed to doing something like this, 6, 4, right? But the jazz way of representing this, or the way that you'd see this represented in a lead sheet would be, you figure out the underlying, okay, the process is similar, right? I guess I'll just tell you the answer first. The jazz way of representing this would be to actually describe it as a slash chord. And a slash chord is just a way of representing inversion. So the slash notation, there's a chord in the numerator and a note in the denominator. So for example, C over G, it's a C major triad that's built with a G in the denominator. That basically, the note G needs to be the bottom note of the chord. So I guess I should say that. Okay. So for example, if you have F over C, what that's saying is you have to have an F major triad where the C is in the bottom. So it could look like this, right? So in this particular case, this is an F major chord with a C in the bottom, which you can, by Roman numeral or by other means, where you kind of build the closed voicing root position chord, right? You kind of determine that, you make the determination that this is a second inversion chord, right? Just by the fact that since this bass note of the chord you're trying to check happens to be the third note of the root position version of that chord, it happens to be that this is a second inversion triad, right? So that's a way that you can, you kind of have to still use that process to figure out what this numerator chord is, right? You still have to build a root position version of the chord in order to know what this numerator chord is. Just to take a step back, the numerator is a chord. The denominator is a note. So the numerator, in this case, is a 3-note chord. The numerator is FAC. Okay? Denominator is C. Right? So what I was trying to say earlier was, well, I guess if you're trying to actually describe this chord using this notation, you would have to figure out the numerator chord, right? The numerator chord is still only inferenced by actually creating a snowman out of the chord. And then by building the snowman, you actually figure out the root of the chord, right? Which in this case is F, right? If I flip this around, I guess you could use the other method where you actually just keep bringing the top note down to the bottom, right? And then it turns out that you indeed see that this is an F major triad, right? So the numerator is an F major chord, which just reduces to F in this case. And the denominator is C. So let's think of a more complicated example. What if we had this? C7 over G. What could that possibly be? Well, let's build the numerator chord first. Okay, so this is a C dominant 7th chord, right? I guess the next question would be, well, all I really have to do is invert this so that this bottom note is really at the bottom, right? So I could just do a flippity flip. I could bring the top note, I can bring it to the bottom, or in this case, I can just bring the bottom note and bring it to the top. At least I'm closer, or at least it'll be in a more appropriate range for the piano. And then what I have here is really this answer. C7 over G is precisely this, right? One sec.
I have a question.
Sure.
For the major and the minor 6, the distance from C to the 6th is not a minor 6 for the minor?
No. No, it wouldn't be. That would actually be a different thing. That would actually be this. If you wanted this chord, you would actually have a C minor with a flat 6, where you add a flat 6. But by default, remember, the 6th is referencing the major scale that's built on the root. So in this case, this will be, by definition, the sixth will be a major sixth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so this is a slash chord right here. This is a C7 over G. Fantastic. Now, what if I, so
isn't that chord technically kind of like a second inversion of a C7?
yes, absolutely. So let's say we're in the key of C major. I'm just using a particular key so that I can use my Roman numeral syntax, because the software doesn't allow me to do like alphabet pitch and then 6/4 nicely compacted like that. So let's say we're in the key of C major, then, or sorry, let's say we're in the key of F major, which I guess we are from before. This would be a 5, and it would be a second inversion. So it would be a 6/5/4/3, right? So yeah, this would basically be the same thing as being a second inversion chord. So in these particular cases, what you see is that the denominator note is actually in the numerator chord. But there are situations where the denominator note is not in the numerator chord. And in those situations, you actually have, I guess there are different possibilities. So I guess in the if the denominator note is part of the numerator chord, it's an inversion of the chord. It's an inversion of the numerator chord. If the denominator note is not part of the numerator chord, it could be a sus chord or it could be a polychord. So for instance, if I did this, if I did a G, F major over G, this would actually be a sus chord. Let's see if it actually makes sense as to why it's a sus chord. So let's actually take this chord and let's try to make it into a squashed rendition of it where it kind of all exists within one octave. Okay? So the way to do that is quite simple. I'm just going to take this chord, bring some notes down an octave, right? Right? And all of a sudden, you see a situation. If you keep bringing the notes down an octave, you kind of see a situation where you have like an F major chord and you have a G. You basically have an F sus2, right? That's another way of writing this particular chord. You could say that this is like an F sus2 over, I guess another way you could write this chord, really. Sorry, not an F sus2, but an F add 2 over G. It didn't like that. Yeah, it liked that. Okay, I guess what I was trying to say earlier is that, well, you kind of proved that in some ways that if I have an F over a G, right, it has a certain kind of soul character to it. If you, okay, what I was trying to show you is basically if I take this chord and I bring it down into one octave, what in a very compact form, you're going to see basically an add 2 voicing. And I guess in this particular case, this numerator note is not in the this denominator note is not in the numerator chord, and it turns out that when you actually put it in, when you actually analyze it in a very closed voicing format, you actually get something that's like an add 2 chord. And I know I call this a sus chord because and it is a sus chord. I'm trying to reconcile the notation here. So I remember earlier Connor basically said, is the sus chord characterized by the third note always being substituted or substituted by another interval? And that is true for the cases where we had for the cases where we just have like 3-note chords, like a sus2 or a sus4, these kind of things. But I don't know if that necessarily remains true in this situation. I guess the takeaway from this is that, one takeaway until I kind of clarify my thoughts on that, is just that you can create interesting combinations by basically stacking a triad where the denominator note doesn't actually exist in the numerator. In this particular case, let's see, like, oh wait, right, you hear this right at the end of Lead on Me, for instance. It's got a, I guess this is a characteristic voicing that's used for, that has a very soulful emphasis, I guess you could say. It's a good chord to know, and it's a chord that I'll probably add, I'm gonna add to your homework, and I'll try to reconcile it with the existing terminology a little bit better, but hopefully you can kind of see that if you do invert this, you do get sort of an add to voicing. And it just happens to be, for whatever reason, that when you take this voicing and you kind of create a very open version of it, it has more of a sus sound to it, or at least that's what people describe it as, okay?
Is that because the bass note is sort of like a substitute for what might have been the third? Because now it's a second on the bottom instead of a third.
Yeah, you know what? I think so. Because yeah, it is a second, but what's throwing me off here is that the fact that there's an A as well. But I think by virtue of the fact that this is so emphasized, like down an octave, I think by bringing it down an octave, it emphasizes it that much more. So I think you are right to say, actually, that's very astute, because this is, in some way, this is the note in question that's really sussing it up. If I had this, that would basically, what I just did here was I just made it this. But by just changing this F to a G, right? In some ways, this G is sort of, well, it's sort of, you could say that it's sort of kind of close to both of these intervals. It could be kind of substituting with one, or it could be substituting with three. I guess just know that if you have this particular chord, it has that particular sound. And I guess the definition of this particular chord is just a major triad with the denominator just being the second of the scale that's built upon the root of that major triad. So for instance, it's a great chord. Anyway, any questions, guys?
Yeah, sorry, I think I missed something, but why is the third chord on the screen written out as F add 2 over G if...
Oh yeah, that's incorrect. I guess if I, okay, so I guess what I meant by that was, if you actually were inverting this, and then well yeah, I guess it's not at all. This is just an F add 2. Yeah, good catch. This would be an F over G. Yeah, I guess the inversion of this would be an F add 2, or if you rearrange the notes, you can get an F add 2. I was thinking about putting it over G from the standpoint that this note right here is a G and this bass note is, but that I was mixing up two analyses. So yeah, thanks for asking me to clarify.
Gotcha.
Great. Any other questions about any of this? Hopefully it's perfectly clear. We'll talk more about, well, we'll move on to other stuff. I just want to make this really clear because I know that this can be a little difficult to understand. And I think it's worth kind of emphasizing. So yeah, great. Sorry for getting here a little late today. Great. Let me stop the recording.
Thank you.
Of course.